Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, and it feels almost like engineering.
Right, yeah. Like it should just be obvious.
Exactly. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points and says, there it is. Broken or not broken, it's clean, it's binary.
And I mean, that binary is deathly comforting. Human beings are fundamentally, we're pattern-seeking creatures.
Right.
We like things to be visible, to be categorized, and, to have a definitive label. We want the world to be neatly sorted into true and false.
But then you step into fields like, say, neurodevelopment or psychology, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just useless. We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, it's murky, right? Where symptoms overlap and the borders between conditions just blur.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And that specific feeling, that intense desire for a clean, binary answer while finding yourself just neck deep in murky waters, that is precisely what happens when human beings try to figure out the right thing to do.
Yeah, and that is exactly where we're going today. We are opening up the physics engine of reality itself. We are looking at the invisible rules that dictate literally every decision you make.
Which is a huge undertaking.
It is. So to ground you in where we are, this is the 7th deep dive in our ongoing philosophical journey.
Yeah.
In the previous parts of this series, we wrestled pretty heavily with epistemology.
Right. Asking, how do we know what we know?
Yeah, exactly. We questioned our senses, our logic. But now, before we move forward into specific historical eras or like individual thinkers, we have to lay down the core baseline for human interaction. We are entering the realm of normative ethics.
Which is arguably the most pragmatic branch of philosophy, I would say. Normative ethics isn't about, pondering the abstract nature of the universe. It's fundamentally concerned with establishing systematic principles that actually dictate human behavior.
The real day-to-day stuff.
Exactly. We're attempting to answer the ultimate everyday question, which is how should we act? Because we all make ethical choices constantly. We decide what to buy, how to speak to a subordinate at work, whether to tell a white lie to a friend, or even how to vote.
So if our philosophy series so far has been us sitting on the couch, figuring out if the controller is plugged in and what the buttons do, today we're finally booting up the game.
I like that analogy.
We're examining the underlying code that governs the physics of the world, right? Like, does gravity exist? Do actions have equal and opposite reactions? Today, we're looking at 3 massive frameworks for human behavior: consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics.
And those essentially act as different physics engines for morality.
Right. And the goal here is to uncover the fundamental divide between what philosophers call the right and the good.
Yeah, that distinction between the right and the good, that is the conceptual fault line that divides almost all moral philosophy. And understanding it, well, it gives you a toolkit to deconstruct the invisible assumptions driving political policies, legal systems, and even your own personal arguments.
Okay, let's start with what feels like the most instinctual way a human being judges an action. If I take an action, the very first thing most people look at is what happens afterward, the result.
The outcome, right?
Yeah, did someone get hurt? Did someone benefit? Did a problem get solved or just made worse?
Yeah.
This instinct points directly to consequentialism, where the good basically dictates the right.
Yeah, in the taxonomy of normative theory, consequentialism evaluates choices entirely by the value of the states of affairs they bring about. Morality is judged solely by outcomes.
Solely by outcomes.
Exactly. The core philosophical claim here is actually pretty stark. It says no action is inherently wrong in and of itself as long as it leads to the best possible result. So the good, meaning the positive outcome, defines what is right to do.
Wow, okay. So if I have to lie to save a person's life, lying becomes morally obligatory.
Yes, it does.
If stealing a loaf of bread feeds a starving family, stealing is right. It's like the ultimate formulation of the ends justify the means.
It really is. And the most famous paradigm of this is utilitarianism, which traces back to British philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
Okay, so let's unpack that, because I feel like people use the word utilitarian a lot without actually knowing the mechanics.
Right, they do. Classical utilitarianism is a very specific flavor of consequentialism. It's formally known as hedonistic act consequentialism. Now, we really need to unpack that terminology carefully.
Yeah, because hedonism sounds like, throwing wild parties and drinking wine all day.
Right, exactly. But hedonism in a philosophical context does not mean chasing base desires. Hedonism here simply claims that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, and pain is the only intrinsic bad.
Oh, okay, so it's about the psychological experience of happiness versus the psychological experience of suffering.
Correct. When a classical utilitarian is trying to figure out the moral rightness of an act, they're essentially doing a mathematical calculation to maximize happiness. Bentham famously believed you could literally quantify this. He called it a philosophic calculus.
Philosophic calculus, that's a mouthful.
It is. You basically measure the intensity of the pleasure, the duration, the certainty that it will occur, and how many people it will affect. The guiding slogan, which you've probably heard, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number.
I mean, reducing all morally relevant factors to a calculation of consequences, it sounds elegant on the surface.
Yeah.
But when you really interrogate the mechanics of it, it becomes incredibly granular. For instance, the sources talk about a major functional divide between act consequentialism and rule consequentialism.
Yes, and that divide addresses a really significant practical flaw in the theory, because act consequentialism demands that you calculate the net good on a case-by-case basis. You evaluate the specific action right in front of you.
Which sounds exhausting.
Exactly. Imagine doing that for every single decision in your day. It would be cognitively paralyzing.
Right. So, like, if I stop at a red light at 3 a.m. and there is absolutely no one around for miles, act consequentialism might say I should actually run the red light.
It might, yeah.
Because waiting causes me mild frustration, which is a negative, and running it harms literally no one because the intersection is totally empty. The math in that isolated moment favors breaking the law.
Which is exactly why rule consequentialism zooms out. It argues that the rightness of an act depends on whether it conforms to a set of rules that, if generally accepted and followed by everyone, would maximize the good.
Ah, okay. So it's about the broader rule.
Right. A rule utilitarian would look at your 3:00 a.m. red light and say, well, the rule always stop at red lights creates a society with drastically fewer fatal car crashes, and that maximizes massive amounts of happiness and preserves life. Therefore, the rule must be followed, even if breaking it in this one specific isolated instance might slightly increase your personal convenience.
That makes a lot of sense. It completely avoids the exhaustion of constant calculation by establishing a sort of macro strategy. But that introduces another dimension, right? Actual versus expected consequentialism. And this is where the timeline of cause and effect gets really, really tricky.
It really does.
Like, does moral rightness depend on the actual long-term consequences of an action, even if they take decades to play out? Or does it depend on the expected consequences based on the available evidence right at the moment you make the choice?
This is a profound tension in the literature. Let's say you give a significant amount of money to a stranger who appears to be destitute and starving. Your intention is to relieve suffering.
Okay, noble intention.
Right, but instead of buying food, that person uses the money to purchase a weapon and commits a terrible crime. Under actual consequentialism, your action of giving the money was objectively morally wrong because the state of affairs it brought about was disastrous.
That feels deeply counterintuitive, though. It holds the moral agent hostage to a butterfly effect they couldn't possibly predict. Like, if I save a drowning child, and 50 years later that child grows up to become a murderous dictator, actual consequentialism implies my rescue was a morally evil act.
Which is precisely why many philosophers favor expected consequentialism. This view argues that the subjective rightness of an action is judged by what a reasonable person could foresee. It evaluates the probability of outcomes given the evidence available to the agent at the time.
So it gives us a break.
Yes, it gives the human being some grace, acknowledging our limited epistemic vantage point. We can't see the future.
Okay, so even if the timeline matters, there's also the question of how much good we are required to do. And the distinction between maximizing and scalar consequentialism addresses this, right?
It does. Maximizing consequentialism is incredibly demanding, like punishingly so. It dictates that you must produce the absolute best possible consequences available to you.
Wait, the absolute best?
Yes. Choosing an action that is good or helpful, but is suboptimal compared to another available option, is classified as morally wrong.
So if I have $50 and I donate it to a local animal shelter, I mean, I've done a good thing. But if donating that exact same $50 to a malaria charity could have saved a human life, a maximizing consequentialist would say, my donation to the animal shelter was actually a moral failure, because they didn't maximize the utility.
Exactly. It treats morality as a strict, rigid threshold. Scalar consequentialism, on the other hand, just completely rejects that binary right versus wrong framework.
Oh, interesting. How does that work?
It views morality on a pragmatic continuum.
Yeah.
So actions aren't right or wrong, they're simply evaluated as better or worse than the alternatives. It is a much more forgiving approach that recognizes degrees of moral value.
Okay, I like that better. But regardless of whether you use the maximizing or scalar approach, the scope of consequentialism is just vast. Because universal consequentialism insists that moral assessment has to consider the consequences for all sentient beings equally. It explicitly rejects partiality.
This is a cornerstone of the theory, and it is radically impartial. I mean, from the perspective of the universe, your happiness is no more important than the happiness of a stranger halfway across the globe.
So my mom doesn't get extra points just for being my mom.
Nope. Your family's interests do not magically weigh more in the utilitarian calculus simply because they are your family.
And this demand for absolute impartiality, this is what leads to the stress testing of this framework. It brings us to the famous trolley problem. Originally introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot, this was designed to isolate these very intuitions.
It's a classic for a reason.
It really is. So
Okay.
let's set the scene carefully for you listening. Imagine a runaway trolley car hurtling down a track. Ahead, there are 5 innocent people tied down, completely immobile. The trolley will hit and kill them all. You are standing right next to a switch. If you pull the lever, the trolley will divert onto a sidetrack. However, there is one innocent, immobile person tied to that sidetrack. Do you pull the lever, sacrificing 1 to save 5?
Right. And if you adhere strictly to pure consequentialism, the mathematics are entirely straightforward. You have an obligation to maximize the good and minimize the bad. 5 deaths is a mathematically worse outcome than 1 death.
Right. 5 is bigger than 1.
Exactly. Therefore, you are morally obligated to pull the lever. The nature of the physical act itself, the fact that you are actively intervening to cause a death that would not have otherwise occurred, is considered irrelevant. Only the moralized value of the final state of affairs matters.
And when surveyed, the vast majority of people actually agree with pulling the lever. It makes logical sense to minimize the loss of life. But if we follow that exact same logic, we hit a horrifying wall.
Yes, we do.
If we only care about the mathematical outcome, doesn't that theoretically justify deeply abhorrent acts, provided the net positive is high enough? Let's adapt the scenario to test the boundaries here. You're a brilliant surgeon. You have 5 dying patients in your ward, each needing a different vital organ transplant to survive.
Okay, setting the stage.
A perfectly healthy young man walks into your clinic for a routine physical. Pure consequentialist math dictates that you should quietly kill the healthy man, harvest his 5 vital organs, and save the 5 dying patients. 5 lives preserved at the cost of 1. Pure act consequentialism seems to not only permit this, but demand it.
And this is where the framework violently clashes with our common sense moral intuitions. While most people pull the lever in the trolley scenario, almost no one agrees that the doctor should harvest the organs of the healthy patient.
Oh, it feels viscerally wrong.
Right. We intuitively recognize a profound difference between the two acts, even though the consequentialist math, 5 minus 1 equals 4 net lives saved, is totally identical. The critique leveled against consequentialism is that it fails to respect the separateness of persons. It treats human beings merely as containers for utility rather than individuals with inviolable rights.
Because if no action is inherently off limits, if there are no absolute boundaries, society just descends into paranoia. I mean, you could never trust a doctor, a police officer, or a neighbor, because at any moment they might calculate that sacrificing you serves the greater good.
Consequentialists are actually acutely aware of this critique, and some have developed theoretical adjustments to deal with it. One such concept is called consequentializing, championed by philosophers like Amartya Sen and Douglas Portmore.
Consequentializing, what does that mean?
They argue that we can incorporate agent relative values into the mathematical calculation itself.
Okay, so if standard consequentialism is agent neutral, meaning the math is done from a purely objective, impartial, view from nowhere type of place, what does it mean to make it agent relative?
It means allowing the evaluating agent's specific perspective to actually hold weight in the calculation. Let's take a dire choice. You can save your own child from a burning building, or you can save 2 strangers. The agent-neutral calculation demands you save the strangers because 2 lives outweigh 1. But an agent-relative consequentialist argues that from your specific vantage point as a parent, a state of affairs where your child survives holds a massively higher intrinsic value to you than a world where they perish.
Oh, I see.
By allowing the agent's perspective to weight the values of the outcomes, the theory can suddenly accommodate loyalty, personal integrity, and familial duties, while still technically remaining a theory focused on outcomes.
I mean, that feels like a theoretical sleight of hand, though. It's taking the non-consequentialist gut-level rules we already believe in, like the duty to protect our own children, and reverse engineering the math so that the calculation justifies what we intuitively wanted to do anyway.
That's a very common criticism.
Because if you can assign infinite bonus points to your own child in the utilitarian calculator, the math loses its objective rigor.
Many critics completely agree with you. They see it as a patch that undermines the core premise of the theory. Because if the math of outcomes can technically justify organ harvesting and then be manipulated by agent relative waiting to forbid it, we lose the sense of a solid foundation. When we face the horror of the organ harvesting doctor, we don't just want the math to work out differently. We want a hard, non-negotiable boundary.
Yes.
We want a rule that says do not murder an innocent person, period, regardless of the consequences.
We hit the wall of pure outcome math, and we realize we need a wall of our own to protect ourselves. And that realization forces a complete paradigm shift. We move from evaluating the outcome of an action to evaluating the nature of the action itself. We enter the realm of deontology.
Yes. The term deontology originates from the Greek deon, meaning duty, and logos, referring to study or reason. So it is the rational study of duty.
Rational study of duty.
Right. The specialized term in its contemporary sense was actually formalized by C.D. Broad in 1930. In this framework, the conceptual dynamic we discussed earlier is flipped entirely. The right has absolute priority over the good.
Meaning that actions are judged by their conformity to moral laws, not by their consequences. An action is inherently right or wrong, entirely divorced from what happens afterward. It is the traffic light that stays red, no matter how empty the intersection is or how late you are for work. The rule is the rule.
Precisely. And to understand the mechanics of this, we really have to examine the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Kant's work is the absolute bedrock of deontological thought. He argued that the moral worth of an action cannot possibly depend on its consequences, because consequences are often completely out of our control.
Right, dictated by luck or circumstance.
Exactly. For Kant, the only thing in the universe that is good without qualification is a goodwill.
We really need to define goodwill here, because normally we might think of intelligence, courage, or even happiness as inherently good things. Why does Kant reject those?
Because intelligence can be utilized by a brilliant criminal to execute a flawless bank robbery. Courage can be exhibited by a ruthless dictator conquering a neighboring country. Even happiness can be derived from malicious sources, like taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune.
Oh, that's true.
None of those traits are inherently unconditionally good. Only a goodwill, which Kant strictly defines as a will that acts out of respect for the moral law, out of pure duty, is absolutely good. It is entirely about the motive behind the action.
So how do we determine what that moral law actually is? Because Kant didn't just leave us with a vague sense of duty. He gave us a specific logical mechanism called the categorical imperative. And this isn't a suggestion. It is a strict test for evaluating our motivations.
Right. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in a few different ways. The most famous is the formula of universal law. He stated, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
Okay, so a maxim is essentially the underlying rule or principle guiding your specific action in that moment, right?
Yes, exactly. Kant is asking you to perform a logical stress test. Before you act, identify your maxim. Then, imagine a world where every single human being in the universe automatically followed that exact same maxim every time they were in a similar situation.
Okay.
Could that world logically exist? If the universalization of your maxim creates a logical contradiction or destroys the very institution your action relies on, the action is morally forbidden.
Let's apply that to a concrete example to see how the mechanism works. Let's say I need money, so I ask a friend for a loan, promising to pay them back next week, even though I know for a fact I will never have the money. My maxim is I will make a false promise to secure a loan when I need money.
Okay, now universalize it.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where everyone who needs money makes a false promise to repay it.
In that world, the very concept of a promise completely disintegrates. No one would ever believe a promise to repay, and therefore no one would ever grant a loan. The institution of promising destroys itself the moment it is universalized. Therefore, my maxim contains a logical contradiction. I am trying to use the institution of promising while simultaneously acting in a way that would destroy it. The act is logically flawed and thus inherently immoral.
It is a brilliant deduction based on logical consistency, not emotional empathy.
Yeah.
The second major formulation of the categorical imperative is the formula of humanity, which has profoundly shaped modern human rights. Kant stated that you must act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end.
Never merely as a means. I mean, we use people as means all the time, right? I use a barista as a means to get my coffee, but I'm paying them, recognizing their autonomy and treating them as an end in themselves simultaneously. I'm not treating them merely as a tool.
Exactly, and this formulation completely solves the organ harvesting dilemma that broke consequentialism.
Oh, right.
Why can't the doctor kill the healthy patient to save 5? Because by harvesting the patient's organs against their will, the doctor is treating the healthy patient merely as a tool, just a biological vending machine for parts. It violates the patient's inherent dignity and autonomy. Deontology builds an impenetrable wall around the individual that the math of the collective just cannot breach.
But the rigidity of that wall creates its own set of severe problems. Kant was notoriously inflexible. He believed that allowing exceptions to moral rules destroys their universality. If a rule can be broken when it's convenient, it ceases to be a universal moral law.
Which leads to the infamous murderer at the door scenario, a critique that Kant himself actually addressed and honestly doubled down on. Kant argued that lying is always wrong under all circumstances because universalizing lying destroys the capacity for human communication. Therefore, if a known murderer knocks on your front door and asks if your friend is hiding in your house, Kant's strict deontology dictates that you cannot lie.
That seems like an utter failure of common sense. If I tell the truth, my friend dies. A strict adherence to the rule basically turns me into an accomplice to murder.
Kant's defense was that you are only responsible for your own adherence to the moral law. You are obligated to tell the truth. What the murderer does with that truth is the murderer's moral failing, not yours.
Wow.
Yeah. But you are correct that for most people, this level of absolute monistic rigidity is paralyzing. Life is not mathematically clean, it is messy, and rules inevitably clash.
Right. If I've made a promise to meet a colleague for an important meeting, I have a duty to keep that promise. But on my way there, I see a child drowning in a shallow pond. I have a duty to render aid and preserve life. If both rules are absolute and exceptionless, I'm trapped. I am doomed to commit an immoral act no matter what I do, which makes the ethical framework feel useless for actual human living.
This specific paralysis drove the development of deontological pluralism, most notably by the 20th century philosopher W.D. Ross. Ross looked at Kant's single absolute foundation and found it lacking. He argued that we don't just have one master rule, we have a plurality of fundamental duties. And critically, he introduced the distinction between a prima facie duty and an absolute duty.
Prima facie is a legal and philosophical term, meaning on its face or at first sight, right?
Yes. A prima facie duty is a general moral obligation that is binding unless it is overridden or trumped by another more compelling duty in a specific context. Ross identified 7 core prima facie duties that map beautifully onto our intuitive moral landscape.
Let's look at those 7, because they illustrate how nuanced this gets. First, fidelity, the duty to keep promises and tell the truth. Second, reparation, the duty to make amends when we have wronged someone. Third, gratitude, the duty to return kindnesses. Fourth, non-injury, the duty not to harm others. Fifth, beneficence, the duty to improve the conditions of others. Sixth, self-improvement, the duty to better our own virtue and intelligence. And seventh, justice, the duty to ensure a fair distribution of goods according to merit.
Now apply those to your drowning child scenario. Your duty of fidelity compels you to keep the meeting. But your duty of beneficence and perhaps non-injury, if you consider ignoring the child a form of harm, compels you to jump in the water. Ross argues that in this moment, you must use your practical judgment to weigh the duties.
Well, the duty to save a life carries massively more weight than the duty to be on time for a meeting. So, while both remain true prima facie duties, in this specific instance, beneficence overrides fidelity. Saving the child becomes my absolute duty in that moment.
Exactly. Ross's pluralism solves the Kantian paralysis. It acknowledges that moral rules are real and possess inherent weight, completely independent of consequentialist math, but it allows for the flexibility necessary to navigate human existence.
There is a very specific, deeply analytical concept from the literature that I want to explore here, because it formally explains a distinction we've been dancing around. We know that in the trolley problem, our intuition says it is okay to divert the train to kill 1 instead of 5. But in the organ harvesting problem, it is evil to kill one to save five. How does a deontologist formally articulate the difference without just saying, well, the hospital murder feels more gross?
This is where we examine Francis Comte's principle of permissible harm. It is a highly nuanced deontological argument focusing on the geometry of intention. Comte's principle states that you may harm someone in order to save a greater number of people if and only if the harm is an effect or an aspect of the greater good itself.
Walk me through the mechanics of that.
Think about the physical causal chain in the trolley problem. You pull the lever, the trolley diverts. The five are saved. The trolley continues down the sidetrack and tragically hits the one person. The death of the one person is not what saves the five. The diversion of the threat is what saves them. The death of the one is a foreseen tragic side effect. You are not using the person on the sidetrack to stop the train.
If the person on the sidetrack magically escaped at the last second, I would be thrilled, and the five would still be saved.
Precisely. But apply that to the organ harvesting case. You cannot say the death of the healthy patient is a mere side effect. You are actively using his death, his physical organs, as the direct causal mechanism to save the five patients. His destruction is required for your success.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
If he magically escaped the operating table, your plan to save the five fails. Deontology draws a rigid line between a foreseen collateral side effect and an intended means to an end.
That is fascinating. It's like the operating system of a computer. Deontology doesn't care if deleting a specific system file would mathematically free up enough memory to run 50 new programs and optimize the entire machine. The security protocol is hard-coded. You do not have root permission to delete that file. The action is blocked at the source.
That's a great way to look at it.
And briefly, this maps perfectly onto divine command theory, which is another form of deontology, except the security protocols aren't written by logical deduction. They are decreed by God.
Yes, in divine command theory, moral obligations arise directly from God's commands. An action is right because God decrees it, not because it produces good consequences. If a divine text commands Sabbath rest, working on the Sabbath is inherently wrong because it violates the command. Whether working makes you wealthier or resting makes you happier is completely irrelevant to the moral assessment. The rule is the rule.
So we have consequentialism, which obsesses totally over the outcome of the action. And we have deontology, which obsesses totally over the rule governing the action. But looking closely at the mechanics of both systems, they share a glaring omission. They both seem to completely ignore the actual human being making the choice.
They really do.
They treat the moral agent either as a biological calculator doing math or a legal robot executing code. And that profound dissatisfaction ushers us into our third architectural framework, virtue ethics.
It is a radical paradigm shift in moral philosophy. Virtue ethics steps back from the obsession with analyzing the isolated action. Instead of asking the immediate question, what should I do in this exact moment, it asks a much broader lifelong question, how should I live?
How should I live?
Yes. The primary focus of moral evaluation is not the act, but the dispositional character and internal qualities of the moral agent.
We are shifting the focus from doing to being. To understand the foundation of this, we have to look back to ancient Greece, specifically to Aristotelian thought. The classical roots of virtue ethics rest on three massive Greek concepts that we need to unpack carefully. First is archeron, usually translated as excellence or virtue. Second is phronesis, which is practical or moral wisdom. And third is eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness, but the literature says that's a very weak translation.
It is a fundamentally inadequate translation. Eudaimonia does not mean a fleeting psychological state of pleasure, like a utilitarian would describe. It translates much better as human flourishing or well-being. It is an objective state of life well lived in accordance with reason and virtue. It encompasses deep relationships, meaningful goals, and community engagement.
And how do virtues function within that pursuit of flourishing? A virtue isn't just a habit, like tying your shoes in a certain way.
No, virtues in the Aristotelian sense are deep, stable, dispositional character traits built over a lifetime of intentional practice. They are ingrained dispositions to think, feel, and act well in specific domains of human life. For example, courage is a virtue regarding how we manage fear and face danger. Generosity is a virtue regarding how we manage our resources in relation to others. Temperance is a virtue regarding how we manage our physical desires.
Aristotle argued that you don't just read a book to become virtuous, you actually have to practice it. You become brave by doing brave acts until bravery becomes your default character setting. The virtues aren't a means to achieve eudaimonia. Exercising the virtues is the very substance of a flourishing life.
Exactly. However, modern philosophy has seen a massive revival and expansion of virtue ethics, particularly since the mid-20th century, spearheaded by thinkers like G.E.M. Anscombe. It is no longer just Aristotelian. The theory has splintered into incredibly diverse modern branches, attempting to ground moral normativity in character without relying on strict rules or utilitarian math.
Let's dissect a few of these modern branches, because the mechanics of how they actually define a right action are fascinating. Let's look at target-centered virtue ethics, formulated by Christine Swanton. She argues that we shouldn't start with some grand abstract definition of human flourishing. Instead, we should start with our existing understanding of specific virtues and map their anatomy.
Swanson provides a rigorous analytical structure to a theory that is often accused of being too vague. She argues that every virtue operates across four dimensions: its field, its basis, its mode, and its target.
Let's apply those four dimensions to the virtue of courage to see how it works in practice.
The field of a virtue is the specific domain of human life it addresses. For courage, the field is situations involving danger, fear, and risk. The basis of moral acknowledgement, what the virtue is responding to, is a threat to something of value. The mode of responsiveness is the way the agent acts, which, in the case of courage, is defending or promoting that value despite the threat. Finally, the target is the ultimate aim of the virtue, which is to handle the danger successfully and preserve the value.
So under this framework, an act is morally right if, and only if, it successfully hits the target of the relevant virtue. And this requires intense contextual awareness. Plunging into a burning building to save a child hits the target of courage. But if a CEO stands up at a board meeting and risks their career to call out corporate fraud, that also hits the target of courage, just in a different field with a different mode.
Precisely. It allows for moral rigor without insisting on a single universal rule for all situations. Another fascinating branch is exemplarist virtue ethics, developed by Linda Zagzebski. Rather than utilizing abstract principles or even analyzing the dimensions of a virtue, this framework grounds all moral duties in the direct observation of exemplary individuals.
This sounds a bit like the popular phrase, "What would Jesus do?" but structured as a formal philosophical system.
It relies on that exact mechanism. Zagzebski argues that we define a right action by pointing to a moral exemplar, a phronimos, or a deeply wise person. You identify someone whose character is undeniably admirable, perhaps a Gandhi, a Nelson Mandela, or even a deeply wise grandparent. The standard of right action simply becomes, what would the moral exemplar characteristically do in these specific circumstances?
That relies heavily on our innate capacity for moral admiration. We don't need a textbook to tell us that someone who sacrifices their comfort to help refugees is virtuous. We perceive it intuitively. We calibrate our own moral compass to theirs. But that brings up an entirely different branch, the ethics of care, which the literature notes was championed predominantly by feminist philosophers like Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings.
Yes, the ethics of care is a profound critique of the entire enterprise of abstract moral philosophy. Traditional consequentialism and deontology are heavily focused on abstract math, universal rules, and emotional detachment. The ethics of care argues that this male-dominated historical perspective misses the foundational reality of human existence, which is that we are fundamentally relational, dependent creatures.
Right, we don't emerge into the world as isolated, autonomous calculators. We're born completely dependent, and we survive through webs of care. Therefore, the ethics of care focuses on receptivity, emotional responsiveness, and the maintenance of actual relationships. It suggests that preserving a vital human connection is often more morally fundamental than obeying an abstract, universalized rule.
If we synthesize these branches, we see the true psychological depth of virtue theory. It acknowledges human emotion as morally relevant. It acknowledges the complexity of social bonds. It recognizes that morality is a lifelong developmental practice, not a series of isolated logic puzzles.
But I want to push back pragmatically here. All of this focus on character, flourishing, and moral exemplars sounds deeply enriching. But when I am faced with a messy, real-time crisis, isn't virtue ethics practically useless? Let's take a common social dilemma. A close friend of mine who is emotionally fragile asked me what I think of their genuinely awful, toxic new partner.
Oh, a classic conflict of virtues.
Exactly. My virtue of honesty compels me to look at them and say, this person is terrible for you, run away. But my virtue of kindness and my ethics of care compel me to support their happiness and say, if you're happy, I'm happy. The virtues are in direct opposition. If the only instruction virtue ethics provides is be virtuous, how does that actually guide my action in that room, in that moment?
This is the most common critique, that virtue ethics fails to be action guiding. But virtue ethicists have a robust, multi-layered response. First, they point out that virtues generate what are called V-rules. The theory doesn't just say be good. The virtues themselves translate into specific directives. Do what is honest, avoid what is dishonest. Do what is kind, avoid what is cruel.
But that just brings me back to the same problem. My V rule of honesty is clashing with my V rule of kindness.
And this is exactly where that second crucial Greek concept comes into play, phronesis, or practical wisdom. Virtue ethics explicitly denies that morality is codifiable. You cannot write an algorithm or a rulebook complex enough to dictate the right action for every conceivable human situation. The variables are simply too infinite.
So a morally immature person possesses virtues like honesty or courage in isolation, like blunt instruments. They might be brutally honest and destroy a friendship, thinking they did the right thing.
Precisely. But a truly virtuous person possesses phronesis. Practical wisdom is the cognitive capacity to weigh the specific context. Phronesis allows you to read the room. In your dilemma, phronesis asks, is your friend in immediate physical danger? Is this a fleeting romance, or are they moving in together? Is your friend in a resilient state of mind, or are they on the verge of a breakdown?
Right, the nuances.
The wise person uses practical intelligence to determine whether, in this highly specific context, the demand for honesty overrides the demand for immediate comfort, or vice versa.
It's the difference between having raw intelligence and having actual wisdom.
Yeah.
So virtue ethics isn't going to hand me a cheat sheet for the test. It's telling me that I have to study, practice, and develop the instincts to pass the test on my own. It demands that I become a better judge of reality.
That is the essence of it. You are building the capacity to judge well, rather than relying on an external formula to do the judging for you.
So we have thoroughly mapped the three fundamental frameworks. Consequentialism anchors everything to the outcomes. Deontology builds walls out of rules and duties. Virtue ethics focuses on the internal character of the agent. For centuries, the academic literature has largely treated these three systems as warring factions. The utilitarians mock the Kantians for being inflexible rule worshippers. The Kantians dismiss the virtue ethicists for being vague and unscientific. But looking at the synthesis emerging in modern philosophy, there's a fascinating realization: they don't actually have to be enemies.
This is perhaps the most pragmatic takeaway from the study of normative ethics. A critical review reveals that these are not mutually exclusive systems. In fact, many modern philosophers argue they can be synthesized into a highly effective, coordinated, multi-tiered hierarchy for human action. Each framework basically solves the fatal flaw of the other.
I want to detail this three-tiered synthesis because when you see how they interlock, it feels like uncovering the holy grail of practical ethics. Let's build the architecture here.
Let's start at the foundation, the base layer. This is the objective standard of rightness, and this layer must be governed by consequentialism.
That makes sense, because ultimately morality has to actually matter in the physical reality of the world. If we design a perfect system of rules and virtues, but the result is the extinction of the human race or endless agonizing suffering, the system is fundamentally broken. Consequentialism provides the ultimate objective anchor, the preservation of global well-being, and the minimization of suffering.
It is the bedrock standard. However, as we thoroughly explored earlier, human beings are terrible at calculating those consequences in real time. Our brains are not designed to process global utility. We are biased toward our in-groups, we get emotionally exhausted, and we possess a dangerous capacity to rationalize our own selfish desires under the guise of the greater good. If we rely purely on the consequentialist base layer for daily decisions, society devolves into chaos and paranoia.
We can't be trusted with the raw math. Therefore, we need the middle layer, the social coordination layer. And this is exactly where deontology installs the guardrails.
Because we cannot constantly calculate the greater good, we must establish hard rules, rights, and societal contracts. Deontology provides the framework for interpersonal trust. If a society is going to function without collapsing, we need lines we absolutely do not cross. We need strict rules against murder, theft, and lying to secure cooperation.
Deontology protects the individual from being sacrificed for the collective, which is the inherent danger of the consequentialist base layer. But even with strict rules in place, there's another problem. A society of people who only obey the rules out of a grim, robotic sense of duty, people who constantly want to steal and murder but are suppressing their urges purely out of respect for the moral law, Well, that sounds like a miserable, cognitively exhausted society.
Which brings us to the top layer, the cognitive efficiency layer. This is the domain of virtue ethics. This is the psychological operating system for our daily lives. We do not wake up every morning calculating the global utilitarian calculus, nor do we mentally rehearse Kant's categorical imperative before we decide to hold the door open for a stranger.
Right. Instead, by cultivating virtues over a lifetime, we internalize those deontological rules as intuitive habits. By developing stable character traits like kindness, honesty, and justice, we naturally do the right thing without the exhausting burden of constant cognitive calculation or fighting against our own base desires.
This synthesis is a masterclass in realistic philosophy. It balances the optimization of global welfare at the base, the protection of human rights in the middle, and the demands of individual human psychology at the top. It creates an ethical guide that actually aligns with how the human brain functions.
Let's ground this massive synthesis in a practical metaphor. Imagine a thriving, complex city. Consequentialism is the city planner. The planner sits in an office looking at macro-level data. Their ultimate goal is to optimize the outcomes for the entire city. The best traffic flow, the fewest accidents, the most efficient commerce. The planner establishes the overarching purpose of the system.
Right, looking at the big picture.
Deontology represents the actual infrastructure on the streets, the traffic lights, the stop signs, the concrete barriers, and the strict speed limits. These are the hard, non-negotiable rules. You cannot run a red light just because you personally calculated that the intersection looked clear and you were late for work. The rules ensure that the thousands of strangers in the city can trust each other not to crash into them. And virtue ethics. That is the disposition of the individual drivers on the road. Good citizens aren't calculating the macro math of urban traffic flow at every intersection, nor are they white-knuckling the steering wheel, desperately quoting the municipal traffic code to stop themselves from driving on the sidewalk. They just stop at the red light automatically.
Yeah.
They yield to pedestrians intuitively. They have practiced being good, attentive drivers until it becomes second nature. The character of the driver allows the rules to function smoothly, and the adherence to the rules ultimately achieves the optimal outcome desired by the city planner.
That is a phenomenal synthesis of the material. It demonstrates precisely how these theoretical frameworks, when properly coordinated, are not historical rivals to be memorized for a test, but vital interlocking components of a complete moral architecture.
Let's take a breath and survey the ground we've covered in this deep dive. We set out to open the physics engine of reality by exploring how we should act. We interrogated consequentialism, grappling with the demanding math of outcomes, the trolley problem, and the terrifying logic of organ harvesting.
A lot of ground.
Yeah. We explored deontology, tracing Kant's categorical imperative, the necessity of absolute duties, and the pluralistic reality of conflicting rules. We immersed ourselves in virtue ethics, moving away from actions entirely to focus on character, flourishing, and the necessity of practical wisdom. And finally, we discovered how these three massive systems integrate to form a functional ethical toolkit: consequences for the ultimate goal, rules for social trust, and virtues for daily human operation.
And this brings the theoretical directly back to the practical for you, the listener. The next time you face a complex decision, whether it is an ethical dilemma in your boardroom, a deeply personal conflict within your family, or evaluating a new piece of legislation, you are no longer reacting blindly. You now have three distinct, powerful lenses through which to analyze the situation. You can systematically ask, what are the ultimate outcomes? What are the inherent rules and duties being respected or violated? And what kind of character am I cultivating by choosing this path? You have a method for deconstructing the chaos.
The physics engine of reality is fully installed, and you know how the code works. But before we step away, I want to leave you with a final thought, a way to stretch these ancient frameworks into our immediate future.
We have spent this time establishing that our ethical frameworks rely fundamentally on human capacities, our ability to foresee consequences, our logical respect for human dignity, and our lifelong emotional cultivation of character.
But we are rapidly entering an era where human beings are no longer the only entities making ethical decisions. Artificial intelligence is already driving our cars on those city streets, screening our medical diagnostics, and deciding who gets approved for a mortgage. When an AI algorithm controls the traffic grid, it's acting as a pure mathematical consequentialist. But can a machine ever truly possess a virtue? Can lines of code ever develop phronesis, that deeply human, contextual, practical wisdom required to know when kindness should override honesty? Or is an AI, by its very architecture, destined to be nothing more than a cold utilitarian calculator, forever maximizing outcomes without ever understanding what it actually means to be a good entity.
And if the AI remains just a calculator, what happens when it encounters its own real-world trolley problem? The diagnostic muddy waters we started with are only going to get deeper.
Something for you to ponder as you step back out into the world. You know the rules of the board. Now it's time to play the game. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.